Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books, out loud, while stoned. In this video, we're going to start part 3, or chapter 3, of Little Blue Book number 1127, titled Christianity and Slavery, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1920-something. And we're going to start off on chapter 3. Chapter 3 is titled The Christian Serf. There is no period in history more obscure than the few centuries in which Europe descends from the height of Roman civilization to the morass of the Dark Ages. The world was too ignorant even to write decent chronicles. Mr. Lecky begins the second volume of his History of European Morals with one of those obsequious tributes to Christianity, to the beauty of its sacred writings, the perfection of its religious services, which are so proudly quoted by religious apologists. They do not mention that 4 pages later, Lecky says, "Few persons, I think, who had contemplated Christianity as it existed in the first 3 centuries would have imagined it possible that its teachings should bend the mightiest monarchs to their will, stamp their influence on every page of legislation, and direct the whole course of civilization for 1,000 years, and yet that the period in which they were so supreme should have been one of the most contemptible in history." On the next page, we are told that this period should probably be placed in all intellectual virtues lower than any other period in the history of mankind, and that the 2 centuries after Constantine are uniformly represented by the Fathers as a period of general and scandalous vice. But I speak of the appalling vices of the period in another volume. Its ignorance is freely admitted by all historians to have surpassed anything known within the limits of civilization. For the later part of the 5th century, we have a work by a Gallic priest, Salvanius. For the 6th century, and for France alone, we have the voluminous and abominably written history of Gregory of Tours. For the first half of the 7th century, we have the very scanty chronicle and equally bad Latin of Frigarius. Then there is nearly a century which is an almost complete blank in trustworthy history. And after that again, only an occasional monkish chronicle. This is the period. Admire, in passing, how the Church had educated Europe, when the new slavery turned into serfdom, and it is impossible to trace the evolution in detail. We know that by the 10th century, slavery as such was generally abandoned. We know that in Europe as a whole, it had been abandoned by the 9th century. We know that the change took place by the conversion of individual slaves into serfs. And since all the slave owners of the time were Christians, it follows that Christians, not Christianity, freed slaves of this new order. That is the only sense in which any person can claim that Christianity abolished slavery, and it is a miserable fallacy. That assuredly is not what religious writers convey to their readers when they say that Christianity broke the fetters of the slave. As I have said, no influential Christian ever condemned slavery, in principle, until the 9th century, and it then only lingered locally. Oh, hydrate. There we go. I turn again to Mr. Lecky's history, confident that he will say the most that can justly be said for the Church to which he did not belong, and a good deal more. The influence of Christianity in this connection was, he says, in the very highest degree, important. Half of his proof consists of an argument that the Christian glorification of humanity made an end of the old pagan contempt of the slave. In view of the language of Pope Leo I and the permanent attitude of the Church in scorning to admit slaves to the ministry or to allow them to marry free Christians, this is an extraordinary statement from a serious historian to make. The next proof is taken from the most discredited medieval legends of the early martyrs, who are described as manumitting slaves by the thousand. Beyond this, Lecky gives only the fact that, as we know, the Christians of the time often gave liberty to their slaves, and he closes with a quotation from the Catholic historian Muratori, which he leaves in Italian, but is well worth translating. And here's the translation. There was in these ancient times no secular lord, bishop, abbot, chapter of canons, or monastery that had not a number of slaves in their service. Very frequently, the seculars used to give the slaves their liberty. Not so the churches and the monasteries, the reason of which was, in my opinion, that manumission is a species of alienation, and it was forbidden by the canons to alienate the property of the church. And since the church was the author of its own canons, it follows that the clergy lagged far behind the laity in freeing slaves. Lecky is more fortunate than he indicates. Lecky is more fortunate when he indicates causes of the development which had nothing whatever to do with religion. I have pointed out how the destruction of the fortunes of the wealthy Romans alienated the vast amount of slavery. It had already at the time sunk considerably, as there had long ceased to be a stream of war captives flowing toward Rome. After the fall of Rome in 410, this main source of slaves entirely disappeared. The world, as I said, passed into such a condition of disorder and brutality that large numbers sold themselves into slavery. But there was nothing like the great slave-holding class of earlier times. In addition, the new rulers of Europe freed slaves who joined their armies, and the population was so appallingly reduced that labor was no longer in the same position as when millions of powerful war captives were available. These political and economic circumstances caused and explained the transition before Christ was born. Roman landowners, in increasing numbers, had realized the higher value of a free worker. They paid the slaves, even in those early days, such wages that one could save enough in 10 years to purchase his freedom. The Stoic lawyers fostered this manumission of slaves as much as Christian bishops ever did, and by the end of the 4th century, even agricultural slavery had been greatly reduced. Some writers say the bulk of the agricultural workers had by that time become colonists, tied to their work on the land, but within those limits, free men. In the new or Christian order, which created a vast number of slaves instead of emancipating a vast number, this process continued. The workers, especially after the year 600, when the papacy owned regiments of slaves, were freed, or they bought their freedom, but they remained chained to the soil in a particular locality. The new rulers, the imperfectly civilized but thoroughly Christianized Teutonic leaders, also increased their burdens as the feudal system developed. Abbots and bishops were, of course, feudal lords, in the same sense as barons and dukes, and their serfs or vassals had no better conditions than the serfs of others. Broadly speaking, as both the beginning and ending of serfdom spread over several centuries, the great majority of the population of Europe were serfs from about the 8th to about the 12th or 13th century, and many millions of them remained serfs long afterward. If we want really to understand the human story and are not content with ingenious arguments or phrases like the abolition of slavery, this is the first point to understand. In pagan Europe, there had been a very large population of free artisans, and they worked less and had more entertainment than any proletariat, even of modern times. In the city of Rome alone, there were large towns everywhere with large populations of free workers. In writing my St. Augustine and his age, I made a careful study of Roman Africa, which is now mainly Algeria and Tunisia. And the impression you get is of a great network of towns with free populations like a modern country. All this was revolutionized by the downfall of Rome. The population of the imperial city itself fell from 1,000,000 to 50,000. Very few other towns in Europe had 30,000 inhabitants. In England, as late as the 13th century, there were only 6 towns with more than 5,000 inhabitants. I do not like to give figures, as even the expert finds the literature of these illiterate ages too scanty for such a purpose. But it is safe to say that 90% of the people of Christian Europe had become agricultural workers, and that almost always meant serfs. Well, what is a serf? The word really means slave, and from our modern point of view, the serf very decidedly was a slave. Writers who talk glibly about the breaking of his fetters never take the trouble to understand what a serf was. The slave was freed, and the reader is asked to admire the beneficence of the religion that freed him. He gets a confused impression that the emancipated slave of the early Middle Ages experienced a change like that of the colored folk of the southern United States in 1865. The kind of apology is totally dishonest. I have before me a little book of this kind issued by the English Christian Evidence Society, mainly in criticism of myself. The writers of the society are men of no serious cultivation or scholarship, and one has to make large allowances for their ignorance of the historical and scientific themes they handle, as in the case of fundamentalist literature in America. But the bluff insolence and recklessness of these religious booklets are astonishing. It opens fire at once with audacity and perversity of modern anti-Christian propagandism, general untruthfulness, malignant libel, and sustains these manners of the hobo to the end. And these are the men who are busy assuring believers that the church uplifted women, freed the slave, educated the world. They have not even sincerity and intelligence enough to ask themselves how. In that case, the Dark Ages came into existence. Let us, as usual, try to get at the realities behind the words. We do not know what proportion of the inhabitants of the Roman Empire were slaves about the year 400 when Christianity obtained power. 2 slaves to 1 free worker would, at that time, be a generous estimate. By the year 900, after 5 centuries of Christian power, there were no longer slaves, but 9/10 of the population of Europe were serfs. What was the difference? The serf now had freedom, but he was chained to his particular job in a particular locality, and soldiers would hunt him down like a deserter if he tried to break away. He was his own master, but he was bought and sold with the estate on which he lived, and he was forced to reap his lord's corn as well as his own, and to fly the colors as soon as his lord saw fit to get up a bloody brawl. He had a house of his own, and it was filthier and more unhealthful than the quarters of most slaves had been in the 4th century. He had a wife and family, and if he dared to resent the philandering of the lord, abbot, or baron's steward with his wife or daughter, he would be flogged or murdered. Saint Bede tells us that in the Anglo-Saxon England, his own country, It was the inveterate custom for a noble to take to his castle any young woman he fancied and sell her when she becomes pregnant. In France, we find a law passed as late as 1579 that serfs or vassals, there had been a fresh emancipation, were in future to be married, not merely coupled like dogs by their masters. The life of the vast majority, or somewhere about 9/10 of the workers of Europe under this new Christian regime, was horrible. They worked, as Harold Rogers has shown, on more than 300 days in the year, from sunrise to sunset. They were utterly despised and most brutally treated by their masters. Their liberty was a sheer illusion. This was the real brotherhood of men under the fatherhood of God. This is the historical reality behind that pretty phrase, the abolition of slavery. What really happened was that instead of captured barbarians being enslaved to work for Romans, now 9/10 of the population of the Christian countries were enslaved. But the next cry is, the church emancipated the serfs. We are told, as usual, how saint this and abbot that urged the better treatment or the liberation of serfs, as if the appearance of a dozen decent men in 6 or 7 centuries redeemed the entire church. The church never condemned serfdom any more than it had condemned slavery. The overwhelming majority of the clerical lords were as unjust as all other masters. When the liberation of the serfs began, the clerical and monastic owners were, as in the case of the slaves, the last to liberate. Icardius, in his Gesetz der Niedern, Volks, German, probably butchered it, page 186, finds it stated in the Chronicles that the church everywhere opposed serfdom, except in the case of its own estates. And the word everywhere is untrue. Abbots and bishops who did anything for the serfs are rare exceptions. Finally, it was again political and economic causes that ended serfdom. Serf owners were finding, as the Roman slave owners had done, that one gets more value out of a really free and happy worker. Large numbers of serfs laboriously saved the money to buy freedom for themselves and their children. Nobles who were setting out for the costly adventure of the Crusades sold freedom to vast numbers of serfs. Spendthrift kings sold them freedom by the 10,000. Then there was the increasing jealousy and hostility of kings, nobles, and towns. A king, a noble, or a town would liberate the serfs of a whole region in order to make more difficult the passage of the army of a rival across that region. The liberation of serfs on religious grounds was a mere trifle compared with the effect of these economic and political causes. So from the 13th century onward, serfdom gradually disappeared. How little religion had to do with it is plainly shown by the unevenness of the development. In profoundly religious Russia, serfdom lasted until 1861. In the middle of the 19th century, 42,500,000 serfs were bought, sold, and brutally exploited in Russia. As badly as ever slaves had been in Rome, they had to wait not for a realization of the true Christian spirit, but for a large growth of skepticism in St. Petersburg and Moscow before they could get elementary human rights. In France, serfdom lasted on a very large scale. One bishop had 40,000 serfs in the 18th century until the Revolution. In Austria, also it lasted until the 18th century. In parts of England, it lasted until the 16th century. In Prussia, until the 19th century. The change was a gradual process from the 13th to the 19th century, without one single authoritative declaration from either the Catholic or Protestant Church or any leader in either church. Well, says the Roman Catholic, we at least gave the free workers of the Middle Ages their wonderful guilds. You did nothing of the kind. My friend, they were of pagan origin, and your church viciously attempted to stifle them in their cradle. A remark in Dr. C. Gross's important work on the guilds, The Guild Merchant, moved me at one time to make some research into their origin. Some writers think them a natural and original growth in the soil of the Middle Ages. Some think they came from old German fraternities. Some believe that they are a development of what survived of the old Roman trade unions or colleges. See Little Blue Book number 1078. Dr. Gross does not accept this third theory, but he makes this curious statement. Imbued with the idea of the brotherhood of man, the church naturally fostered the early growth of guilds and tried to make them displace the old heathen banquets. After what I have said about the condition of 9/10 of the men, women, and children of Christendom in those days, even a religious leader will merely smile if I call this imbued with the idea of the brotherhood of man a piece of piffle, rubbish, or bunk. It is the usual game of paying a tithe to the church. But I was intrigued by these old heathen banquets, which had to be displaced. What heathen banquets were there to be displaced at the end of the 8th century, when the guilds are first mentioned? And how does a trade union replace a banquet? So, it all came out. As I say in my book on Rome, Little Blue Book number 1078, in Greek and Roman workers had regular trade associations with periodical suppers and patron deities. These still existed in the Eastern or Byzantine Roman Empire in the 10th century, but it is or was generally supposed that Europe lost them in the ruin of the Roman Empire. As we saw, however, the literature of Europe is so poor and meager after the 5th century that we could easily lose sight of them. What we do know is this. The first mention of guilds, called guildome, is in the Capitularies of Charlemagne at the year 779. It is a severe prohibition of people conspiring together in guilds and taking oaths in the year 805 and 821. This prohibition was repeated, and savage penalties were attached to it. Charlemagne died in 814, and it was the church which was continuing the opposition of the guilds, as it had dictated the measures of Charlemagne. Then we find a synod held at Nantes, 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 in the year 852, legislating in the same sense. It attacks the associations popularly called guilds, or confraternities. It forbids them to hold suppers and speaks severely of priests who get drunk and sing ribald songs at these suppers. It directs that the confraternities must not in future meet unless a priest is present, and it orders the members to attend church regularly. This is the whole of the earliest evidence about the guilds, and it makes three things certain. 1. The church quite clearly did not found the guilds. 2. The church absolutely and violently opposed the guilds for nearly a century after we first learned of them. 3. The church failed entirely to suppress them, so it began to assume control of them. And the most reasonable, indeed the only reasonable theory of this violent opposition is that the guilds were pagan. If anybody supposes that the church would condone oaths because they were blood-curdling, or suppers because they were drunken, he must know much about the Middle Ages, as an 18-year-old nun does. Everybody fed and drank and swore most grossly. I show in the New Light on Witchcraft, Little Blue Book number 1132, that paganism survived in the Middle Ages to an extent far beyond what historians used to imagine, and everything here points to such a survival. The guilds are a reappearance of the old Roman colleges, and they retained a pagan character. What Dr. Gross confusedly calls old heathen banquets are precisely the suppers of the early guilds. The decree says so. The evidence I have given, which I dug out of the Capitulary of Charlemagne and a Capitula Synodica of Hincmar, is earlier than any quoted in the works of Gross, Walford, Erbstadt, Müller, or any other authority on guilds. So do not quote their opinions as to the origin of guilds against me. Their studies begin at the time when the church, unable to suppress, had captured the guilds, as they captured everything in the Middle Ages. For a time, organizations, until in the 15th and 16th century, they degenerated and were abandoned. All that the church did was, for its own sake, to adopt them and put a coat of Christian paint on them. In fine, while we admire the work which the guilds did for 2 or 3 centuries, let us keep some sense of proportion. The craftsmen of the guilds were a very small fraction of the population of Europe. We have no statistics, but the religious apologist cannot escape on that account. Even in the early part of the 19th century, when machinery had already begun to displace domestic industries, the agricultural workers alone were 1/3 of the whole. In the Middle Ages, a vast amount of work which is now done by skilled workers was done by the women in the home or by serfs. Indeed, some industries, such as brewing, were left to women. The craftsmen who formed guilds were just the smiths, carpenters, masons, butchers, and a few other bodies of workers in the towns. Certainly they were, in the days of the guilds, not 1/10 of the community. Pardon me. What truth or sincerity is there in thus magnifying the services of the guilds to 1/10 and hiding out of sight the misery and crushing burdens of the 9/10? What regard for historical facts is there in the claim that the church gave even these workers their guilds? What moral principle justifies a writer in saying that the church of Christianity accomplished one or another reform because a member of the church, an abbot or a bishop, here and there urged the reform, while thousands of abbots and bishops exploited the workers for every one that helped them, and the official spokesmen of the church were dumb? Yet that is how, at every step, the case for Christianity in regard to the abolition of slavery and serfdom and the improvement of the lot of the workers is made up. And even a case thus dishonestly pleaded is damned by one massive fact. The condition of the workers of Europe at the beginning of the 19th century, Before we reach this, however, let us glance at the relation of Christianity to black slavery. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 3. And that's where we'll stop today's video. So, this is the end of chapter 3 of Little Blue Book number 1127, titled Christianity and Slavery, written by Joseph McCabe. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 4.